Theme 7. Social Issues. Gap Filling. Reading 1. It is terrible, but we are not powerless against crime. The first step towards preventing crime is to understand its nature. Most crimes are against property, not people. Most crimes are not carried out by professionals, nor is it carefully planned. Property crimes thrive on opportunity. They are often committed by adolescents and young men, the majority of whom stop offending as they grow older. Peak ages for offending are 15 to 18. Also, and not surprisingly, the risk of crime varies greatly depending on where you live. This reliance by criminals on the easy opportunity is the key to much crime prevention. Motor cars, for example, are a sitting target for the criminal. Surveys have shown that approximately 1 in 5 drivers do not always bother to secure their car by locking all the doors and shutting all the windows. In approximately 30% of domestic burglaries, the burglar simply walks in without using force. If opportunities like these did not exist, criminals would have a much harder time. The chances are that many crimes would not be committed, which would release more police time for tackling serious crimes. Theme 7. Social Issues. Gap Filling. Reading 2. The Trade in Rhino Horn. Last year, thieves broke into a Scottish castle and stole only one thing, a rhino horn, which at 1.5 meters was the longest in the world. In China, pharmaceutical factories have been building up collections of antiques made from rhino horn for the sole purpose of smashing them to powder to make the essential ingredient of many of their medicines. And in Africa, poachers continue to die in the search for the black rhino. Recently, conservationists met to plan a campaign to persuade countries where rhino horn is still part of the traditional medicine to switch to substitutes. The biggest threat to the survival of the rhinoceros is the refusal of certain countries to enforce a ban on domestic trading in rhino horn. The rhino horn is included in many remedies for disorders ranging from fevers to nosebleeds. Horn, like fingernails, is made of keratin and has no proven medicinal powers. Traditional substitutes, such as horn from buffalo or antelope, are regarded as second best. The battle is thought to be winnable, but it may be harder than the battle against the trade in ivory, for there is a difference between the two commodities. Ivory is a luxury. Rhino horn, people believe, could save the life of their child. Theme 7. Social Issues. Reading Comprehension. Reading 1. The organisation that today is known as the Bank of America did start out in America, but under quite a different name. Italian-American A.P. Giannini established this bank on October 17, 1904, in a renovated saloon in San Francisco's Italian community of North Beach, under the name Bank of Italy, with immigrants and first-time bank customers comprising the majority of his first customers. During its development, Giannini's bank survived major crises in the form of a natural disaster and a major economic upheaval that not all other banks were able to overcome. One major test for Giannini's bank occurred on April 18, 1906, when a massive earthquake struck San Francisco, followed by a raging fire that destroyed much of the city. Giannini obtained 2 wagons and teams of horses, filled the wagons with the bank's reserves, mostly in the form of gold, covered the reserves with crates of oranges, and escaped from the chaos of the city with the client's funds protected. In the aftermath of the disaster, Giannini's bank was the first to resume operations. Unable to install the bank in a proper office setting, Giannini opened up shop on the Washington Street wharf on a makeshift desk created from boards and barrels. In the period following the 1906 fire, the Bank of Italy continued to prosper and expand. By 1918, there were 24 branches of the Bank of Italy, and by 1928, Giannini had acquired numerous other banks, including a Bank of America, located in New York City. In 1930, he consolidated all the branches of the Bank of Italy, the Bank of America in New York City, and another Bank of America that he had formed in California, into the Bank of America National Trust and Savings Association. A second major crisis for the bank occurred during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Although Giannini had already retired prior to the darkest days of the Depression, he became incensed when his successor began selling off banks during the bad economic times. Giannini resumed leadership of the bank at the age of 62. Under Giannini's leadership, the bank weathered the storm of the Depression and subsequently moved into a phase of overseas development. Theme 7. Social Issues. Reading Comprehension. Reading 2. Basic to any understanding of Canada in the 20 years after the Second World War is the country's impressive population growth. For every 3 Canadians in 1945, there were over 5 in 1966. In September 1966, Canada's population passed the 20 million mark. Most of this surging growth came from natural increase. The Depression of the 1930s and the war had held back marriages, and the catching up process began after 1945. The baby boom continued through the decade of the 1950s, producing a population increase of nearly 15% in the 5 years from 1951 to 1956. This rate of increase had been exceeded only once before in Canada's history, in the decade before 1911, when the prairies were being settled. Undoubtedly, the good economic conditions of the 1950s supported a growth in the population, but the expansion also derived from a trend toward earlier marriages and an increase in the average size of families. In 1957, the Canadian birth rate stood at 28 per 1,000, one of the highest in the world. After the peak year of 1957, the birth rate in Canada began to decline. It continued falling until in 1966 it stood at the lowest level in 25 years. Partly this decline reflected the low level of births during the Depression and the war, but it was also caused by changes in Canadian society. Young people were staying at school longer. More women were working. Young married couples were buying automobiles or houses before starting families. Rising living standards were cutting down the size of families. It appeared that Canada was once more falling in step with the trend towards smaller families that had occurred all through the Western world since the time of the Industrial Revolution. Although the growth in Canada's population had slowed down by 1966, the increase in the first half of the 1960s was only 9%. Another large population wave was coming over the horizon. It would be composed of the children who were born during the period of the high birth rate prior to 1957.